All right, realist explanations for the end of the Cold War. If you remember right, remember we talked about realism. When I say realism, you say, I hope you said it out loud. If you're sitting in a coffee shop somewhere, just hollered out the word power. Realism is all about power. And so if realism is all about power, then what should we be looking at if we're trying to explain the end of the Cold War? The answer is changes in the distribution of power. Okay, so what are some of those things? And the realists are going to fall back on three main factors that change that sort of power distribution that's going to lead to the end of the Cold War. So factor number one, as you guys were just looking at in that video, it's going to be Ronald Reagan. Now Reagan himself, realists won't really care that much about Reagan or Obama or any individual. It's what Reagan did that the realists say that's what led to the end of it. And it's going to cause U.S. power to grow. And what we see first from Reagan is Reagan comes in and he says we need to spend more money on the military. We're just going to dump tons of money into the military. We're going to grow the size of U.S. power around the world. After the 1970s, post-Vietnam, the United States, it kind of stopped spending a lot of money on military. That was back in 1972. And so by the time the end of the 70s roll around, Reagan comes in and says, nope, we're spending money. Not only that, there is an economic recovery. There's a initial, like his first year, there was a little economic dip, and it had nothing to do with him. But somewhere in about 1981, 1982, the economy begins to recover, and the U.S. economy grows very quickly. So does the economies of Japan and Europe, our allies. And so that economic growth, that military growth, is going to increase the power of the United States. The second thing is something called Star Wars, which you guys just saw a video on. Star Wars was its nickname, but SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, let's talk about this. I know it was hinted at in that video, and maybe you're following along, or maybe you're just going, wow, video is so much better today than it was back then. This was a space-based anti-missile system. So the idea being, of course, if they fire a nuclear missile at us, we can shoot it down. It's not that we just deter them. Remember, mutually assured destruction is all about deterrence. Make sure they don't fire in the first place. But if they fire, the whole thing falls apart. And what this essentially says is, once they fire, we can shoot that missile down. So it doesn't really matter if they fire or not, which means how much power do their missiles have? The answer is zero. So if you can make this work, if you can make Strategic Defense Initiative work, and they don't have it, all of a sudden all your missiles still work, and all their missiles don't, and the power imbalance is huge, and all of a sudden you are back in control. We move from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, essentially, because there is no real power in the Soviet Union. This violates the mutually assured destruction, no first strike rule. Now, you might say, that's the whole point. I just watched this video. That was their whole point, is they can't strike us first. That's safety. That's security. But, of course, one of the problems of this that people are saying is, if we put this into place, the day before it gets turned on, if the Soviets know they're going to lose all their power the next day, they're going to fire their nuclear missiles the day before. So people were saying, like, we don't have this yet. So this did not exist, and it still doesn't exist. We've been trying to do this for 30 years since. Has it been 30 years? Yeah, about 30 years ago. We can't do this. It's really hard to shoot a missile down out of the sky. And you might be able to get one or two, but you can't get the hundreds that are flying at you all at once. So this has been sort of a bust. But the point is that the Soviets didn't know that. They thought this could work. They knew we didn't have it, but they thought it could work. And if it does, then they'll be without power, so maybe we need to strike first. And people were saying, oh, there's going to be a nuclear war because the United States is going after this. Something we've talked a little bit about, but we'll talk more about later, called the security dilemma. If you're searching for, sometimes getting more security actually makes you less secure. By getting this shield, you actually create more likelihood of war rather than less likelihood of war. And then, of course, that would then, the other argument be, it would unbalance power. But it turns out that because we didn't have it, and because we were far enough away from developing, like it wasn't going to be turned on the next day, like the Russians knew we were working on it, but they also knew we didn't have it yet. And so it did two things at once that actually were more peaceful, I guess you could say, again, from the realist standpoint. The Soviets knew it was coming, and they were super nervous about it, and they were super trying to do things to make this stop. On the other hand, they weren't so concerned about it that they had started launching nuclear weapons the next day. The point about both of these things is these would cause U.S. power to go up relative to the Soviet Union. All right, great. That in of itself was probably, but just so you can see this here, at some point around here, the United States starts saying, man, building more nuclear weapons, we can't really afford that, but they kept sort of making the ones they had better and better and better. So again, these numbers over here reflect the number of actual missiles. It doesn't reflect the size of each warhead, the number of warheads in each missile. And also one of the things the United States starts doing is it starts spreading out where it puts its nuclear weapons. So not just sort of in silos in the United States, but making subs and making this and making that. And that was how they were going to sort of do that. All right. Another realist explanation. Oh, wait, I'm continuing that one. I got another slide here. So we're still talking about Reagan. We're still talking about U.S. power grows. Another thing is the Reykjavik summit. So in 1986, Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, they meet in Reykjavik. And what Reagan does is it's actually kind of it's a good diplomacy move. He said, look, Gorbachev, I totally get it. If you think we're going to have Star Wars, you're going to fire on us first before this. We don't want that nuclear war. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to share our SDI technology with you. And since we'll both have this nuclear shield, once we have that in place, we can eliminate nuclear weapons. No problem. Now, does Gorbachev take him up on this? The answer is no. He rejects the offer. So think about, why would Gorbachev say, I don't want your missile shield technology? Again, from a realist point of view, it's pretty obvious. The realist is going to say, the Soviet Union can't trust the United States for its own survival. In fact, it's always going to think the United States is trying to undermine it. So if the United States shares their technology, then the Soviets are going to think the most likely thing is it's going to be bad technology. They're not really sharing it. They're sharing something fake, or they're sharing something that has what they have like a Trojan horse, which means that once they put it into place, then the United States is going to flip a switch and all their shields come down, and then the United States is still in power again. So you can't trust, I guess, is what the way the realist would say, and so he rejects this offer. There are lots of problems with Star Wars. Let me just talk about a couple problems with Star Wars here for just a second. Not the movie. The Star Wars movies back in the 80s were great. It was the later ones that were a little more problematic. But for this, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Soviets did not trust the United States. Again, this is a very realist thing, self-help. So you couldn't share that technology. The technology wasn't ready. It's still not ready today. Every once in a while, you'll see, I don't know that you'll see, I've seen it before, but it's been probably 5-6 years. You see bright lights out over the ocean where they're testing a Navy-based version of Star Wars, and it misses more often than not. It's kind of problematic. And then the technology is just super expensive. And this becomes one of the big pieces of the puzzle as well. The U.S. has to dump tons of money into SDI research that may or may not work. But the Soviet Union can't sit back and wait and find out if that technology works or not. The Soviet Union has to put tons of its money into it as well. I don't know, is it rubles? Into it as well. The Soviet Union doesn't have as much money as the United States does. And so if it's going to shift from an arms race into a spending race, the United States is going to win that race all over the place. All right. Factor number 2. So again, we have this Reagan, and his policies essentially caused, from the realist standpoint, Reagan and his policies caused the U.S. power to grow. A second factor is Japan and West Germany are revived. So after World War II, these two countries kind of are in the crapper. But now, by the 1980s, Japan is probably the second most strong economy in the world, maybe third to West Germany. West Germany is up there as well. They're both allies of the United States. They're not the United States, but they're still allied with the United States. And so the amount of economic power, which we talked about before, remember fungible? One type of power can be transformed into another type. So if these three economic powerhouses have all the sort of economic power, they can transform that into military power, and that shifts the sort of balance. So as they get stronger, the U.S. is going to get stronger as well. A third factor is the 80s were a bad decade for the Soviet Union. They were a bad decade for many people, but really for the Soviet Union. And so this U.S. power, or Soviet power, shrinks. In 3 years, they had 3 leaders. There was just a succession where they would elect somebody old and sick, and they would die within a year or 6 months, and then they'd have to elect somebody else or select somebody else, and they would die, until you finally got Gorbachev. But essentially for a while there was a lot of instability in their leadership, and they were focused inwardly rather than outwardly. Another problem they had was Afghanistan. They sent troops into Afghanistan in, I think, 1979, and it, just like it did for the United States in 2001, it turned into a hot mess. It's a really mountainous area. It's really easy to sort of resist these global powers that come in, and the Afghanistan turned into a real mess for them. Kind of they were calling it the Soviets' Vietnam. It really bogged them down. The Soviet economy was in the crapper. The U.S. economy was in the crapper at the beginning of the 80s. It recovered in a way the Soviet economy did not recover. And so if they were going to keep up in terms of building new missiles, building tanks, investing in SDI, that was coming from money they just didn't have, and that was causing problems throughout their society. And then Gorbachev had 2 goals back in 1985 when he comes in. They're considered unachievable together. So his 2 goals when he came in, he said, look, we're going to revive the Soviet economy. The Soviet economy kind of is crap right now, so we're going to fix it up. All right, good. Hooray. Sounds good. And then we're going to avoid a new arms race, such as SDI. Now, here's the problem. They just weren't achievable. The Soviet economy had bigger problems than just, let's spend better or let's save better. And avoiding a new arms race, that really required Reagan to say, I don't really want to do this anymore. He didn't. He kept going with it. And so they couldn't avoid this or you'd lose power. Couldn't do this just because that wasn't how their economy was built. And so it just didn't really work. And in the end, the whole story kind of sums up like this. The Soviets just couldn't compete, and it just sort of collapsed. Rather than turn into a full-scale war, before the Soviets realized that the power imbalance was already so strong, they didn't have a shot. And it just kind of fell apart rather than turned into war. That's the realist explanation. Again, it all comes down to power. How does the power distribution in the world, and how does it change in such a way that it didn't lead to such an imbalance of power that a war starts, but it doesn't stay a balance of power in the terms of a bipolar world. It sort of almost very, very quickly shifts from the U.S. and the Soviet Union are seen as equals to the U.S. is so much stronger than the Soviets that it's not even a bipolar world anymore. It just happened quickly. That's the idea. All right, you're going to watch another video here we're going to talk next about liberal explanations. And if the realists turn to Reagan as sort of Reagan's policy sort of the thing doing it, liberals say, no, the real reason was Gorbachev.